Okay, I don't know if I'm ready to do this, but let's give it a try. Okay, today I want to talk about finally. Uh, this is an interesting topic, and I have a couple of thoughts about it that I want to share with all of you. And I hope it can spark an interesting debate, an interesting discussion. We may disagree, and that's totally fine. I think, yeah, there are some very interesting things to say about final and specifically why I like to use it. And I know many people, well, there is kind of a division, right? There are programmers who really enjoy using final, there are programmers who really hate it. And I think it's kind of too close minded to say that all people within the Laravel community hate final. However, I did notice a lot of people within the Laravel community who kind of don't really enjoy using it, while within Symfony, a lot more developers are used to final. And I just want to put it out up front that the two approaches are fine. I mean, there's no denying here that even without final, people can write great code, and I think Laravel has proven that indeed you don't need final to be successful. So, just to be clear about that. However, I do feel that using final has some benefits over not using final. And I want to explain my train of thought here. I want to share it with you. And, you can share your comments in the comments section, or, you can make a video as well if you want to. That would be nice. So yeah, final classes, making it so that a class cannot be extended by another class. And I want to dive into a couple of reasons why I like that. And let me say, like at the beginning of my rant with Brent, that, for me, it's not necessarily about final itself. It's about using final that will lead to kind of forcing developers to write code in a certain way. And I like writing code in a certain way, So let's start with two main reasons why I like final, and then we'll dive deeper into them. Okay. So the first one, I want to use final because it makes my life easier. And with my life, I mean as a maintainer, right, of open source code. I write a little bit of open source code these days. I used to work at a company that did a lot of open source. They didn't use final, and I actually had a lot of discussions about this with my colleagues back then, because this was already a heated debate back then. But I would say that as from the point of view as an open source maintainer, using final makes it so that the life of the maintainer is easier. And you know why? Because, using final, there is just less room for, what should I say here, for other paths. Let me explain here. If you can extend the class and if people can override your code, you have to take that into account if you don't want to end up with buggy code, at least. If you make your class final, you eliminate a range of possibilities that developers simply cannot take anymore. People using your package, they cannot override a method anymore. They have to find ways around that. So it makes my life a lot easier without having to do anything besides just plopping final there. However, I would make the argument that it's also possible to make the package users' lives easier, but it requires a little bit more thinking, and that's my second point. But let me think here whether I wanted to say anything else about this first point here. That is that you could also make the argument that using final ensures correctness, because this is some like a pattern I've observed in many cases. Packages, they just open their source code, right, for extension, and they make everything protected, and people just swoop in and start plugging in their own code. Basically, it kind of reminds me actually of WordPress event hooks. Having several extension points where you can hook in and create your own thing, right? But being able to do so doesn't ensure like the correct flow of your program anymore. As a package maintainer, again, from the maintainer's point of view, you are making assumptions about like what your code will do, and if there is a possibility that people who you don't know are coming in and at runtime doing stuff by extending your class, it opens just a lot of room for incorrect behavior. And in the end, and I realize this is a pretty like selfish thing to say, but in the end, people will encounter issues. They'll come to your repository, they'll make an issue for it, and you'll have to figure it out. This is open source. It's all just done in free time. You might have some contributors and people helping out, but in the end, as an open source owner, you have the final say basically, and if something breaks, you're the one having to fix it. Now, what I'm talking about here are like these false positive issues that pop up, and they do happen. People plugging into your code, suddenly causing a range of like unforeseen behavior, things you didn't account for because of all these extension points. So final, it makes my life easier. And I know it's a selfish thing to say, but let's also make the case, and this is my second point here, final forces people to write better code. And you might be, it might not disagree with that upfront, but I want to explore this thought a little more. So a common like phrase that's used when open source authors make their code final, and when they encounter people who want to extend and change the code from the inside out, they get frustrated because they don't want to be babysitters, right? They say, I can make my own decisions, and if I want to break stuff, I'll break stuff. Just give me that freedom. Now, sure, you can do that. I mean, I don't care, unless, of course, there are issues because of very subtle, unforeseen consequences. Then I am impacted by it. But that goes back to the first point. But let's look at it from my own point of view. So, using my own code basically, and this is something I have run into several times before. That when I don't use final, and even though I know these things, right? I don't use final, and I end up writing code. I end up writing myself in kind of a corner. I end up with a mess, and that's really because it's not because of final, but it's because final is forcing me to make some decisions that improve my code. And I'm going to show that to you with an example. Let's say here, very simple example. We have a blog post. Let's just call it blog, or maybe even post. No, blog post API. Blog post API, right? This is a class, and it has a method, fetch posts, something like this. Okay. Also has a method, fetch post, something like this. It's an API, and this is a package that I maintain, and I want to use it myself in some of my projects. It doesn't really matter. Let's say one of my projects, it requires a slightly different approach to how I authenticate with this API, and slightly different requirements, and the package author has I'm the package author, right? I have foreseen that, and I actually made like blog post API. I made it extensible, right? And it has a method. It's called authenticate. And this is this hook, right, that I was talking about. And you can extend with your own blog post API extends blog post API, and you can hook into that authenticate method and make changes there, right? Fair enough. I mean, most of us are familiar with this kind of pattern. It might not be a blog post API, it might be something else. But like these extension points, right? We're extending from a superclass, and by doing so, we have a way to hook into the package's functionality. Okay, let's say this class was final, and that means that this is just not possible to do, right? Let's do it like that. This isn't possible. Yeah, that leads to a lot of frustration, because now we cannot easily do what we wanted to do here. Actually, we might be totally stuck and have to fork the package if we want to solve our problem. Okay, does that sound familiar? I mean, I've run into these cases more than once. Not always with the blog post API, but this is something that happens. You use a package, it uses final, and you get stuck. It might actually also have to do with like PHP version upgrades and stuff like that. And there's a small part that's incompatible with the newest PHP version. You want to move on, and you don't have a way to hot patch the stuff, and you're stuck. That leads to frustrations because that stupid class is made final. Why did people do that? Okay, let's zoom out a little bit, and let's go back to our initial API here. We have blog post API, fetch posts, fetch post, and each of these methods actually does a couple of things. First, it will authenticate some OAuth stuff, maybe, I don't know. Second, it will send the request, and third, it will map the data to some kind of DTO, right? That makes sense. These are very common steps when you're sending API requests. Now, for our case, we have to like hook into the authenticate method to make some changes. But we're stuck because, this class is final, and we cannot do anything with it. But I would say that final isn't really the culprit here. The culprit is the fact that we have one class that does a lot of things. It authenticates with OAuth, it sends the request, and it maps the data to the DTO. Data DTO, yeah. And so I would say that final isn't necessarily the problem here. Final is just revealing an underlying problem. Instead of one class doing a lot of things, I would say it would be much better to have separate concerns here. We need an API authenticator. That's a really difficult word for me to type. It's probably wrong. Anyway, an API request dispatcher, I don't know, and an API mapper. These words, they suck, but I mean, you get what I mean with that. So let's say we extracted these three concerns into separate classes. Then we need a way to like link all of them together. And that's where something like, I don't know, API gateway could come in, something like that. And it takes three parameters, like the authenticator, the dispatcher, and the mapper, basically, right? And this is interesting because we went from one class with extension points to one class with several dependencies, dependency injection. And this is composition over inheritance, right? We're composing our API gateway out of three smaller pieces and composing it together into something we can use from the outside, our gateway. And you might now think, okay, we've just moved code around in order to facilitate final, but what have we gained with it apart from just making it work with final? Look at how much extra steps are here because the final is in the way, basically. Well, yeah, there is an advantage here. At least I think of it as an advantage, and that is that each of these components here, uh, I've written these class names here, but these actually are interfaces. They aren't concrete implementations. It would be something like OAuth authenticator, HTTP dispatcher, something like that. Object mapper, I don't know. I'm not really in the mood for thinking of great names. But by having this interface here, I can now have several implementations of that same interface, and that makes mocking, for example, super easy, because now we can say something like API mock authenticator and mock dispatcher and mock mapper. Probably for a mapper there would be less use case, but something like this, which immediately also solves the whole mocking problem with final, which is an argument that's often used because you cannot mock objects that are final. Well, you don't need to, because all of these classes here, they are very small. Like API authenticator will probably only have one or two methods. Request dispatcher the same, API mapper the same. They just work together with this API gateway, but in themselves they are very small and concise interfaces with one or two or maybe four implementations. And this is the real value to me. Like, it's not about final, but final forced me to think about my design here and to actually come up with a better design. At least I think it's better. Like, I prefer small classes that can be tested in isolation, that don't require a lot of setup work in order to test. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say that final forces people to write better code. It's not final itself, but it's forcing me personally to stop and think about how I will design a code base. Now, this leads immediately to like the biggest issue when people say, yeah, final, you're just making our lives difficult and you want to babysit us, and when people use a package that uses final. And that's because these packages, they aren't properly designed for final. Packages that just plop the final keyword in front of some classes and still write huge classes without any interfaces, without any means to properly inject different implementations for those interfaces. Yeah, that doesn't work. I totally get that. Final doesn't work just by plopping final there. And that for me is like the biggest argument here. It's not about final itself. It's about final forcing you to write better code. Let me actually write it down here. It's not about final. It's about what final forces you to do. As soon as I understood this part here, as soon as I understood that final is helping me and possibly people who are using my code to write better code, yeah, then it's worth it for me. And in all honesty, I'm using a lot of final these days in Tempest code base. Everything's final. Never do I run into these kind of frustrations that I can't hook into some place because it's final. That doesn't happen, and that is because this framework is designed from the ground up with final in mind. Everything's final. If it's not final, it should be an interface. Basically, there are one or two exceptions, but in general, we have a rule that enforces exactly that. Let me search for it here. Yeah, over here we have this extension for PHP Stan, so that we can do architecture testing. And here we have a clear rule that whenever a class is not an interface within the Tempest namespace, it should be final, except for these two edge cases. And in this case, like route, it is an attribute that's meant to be extended. It can be used on its own as well, but it's part of the routing API. It's meant to be extended. And integration test is also, well, it's an abstract class, so it's meant to be extended as well. It provides like the base layer for testing Tempest packages. So, but apart from that, everything must be final. And you know what? It works. We have quite a lot of code now already. We're not done yet. It's a work in progress, but let's see here. We have some final classes, right? And we don't run into any problems with final, but that's because we kept final into our minds from the very start. And so if you want to use final, if you want to benefit from final forcing you to create a better design, you will need to accommodate for it. You cannot just make your code, your classes final and be done with it. It requires more than that. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about final. It's not about final. It's about what final forces you to do. And that is, write better code, at least in my opinion. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. It's totally fine to disagree. I'm totally fine with that. But yeah, I would like to learn from you. So leave a comment down below. While you're down there, leave a like or a dislike if you really, really hated what I said here. But if you're like, okay, we're disagreeing, that's fine. And we can talk about it. And leave a like as well. That would help me out. So yeah, with all of that being said, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.